The Galactic Council saw humans as pets until they broke their chains. The stasis field crackled against my palm the moment I touched it, not painfully, just a firm, invisible push, the kind a parent gives a child who reaches for a hot stove. I pulled my hand back and stared at the shimmer in the air where the observation scaffolding used to be. 3 days ago, a boy named Oliver tried to climb it. He was 11 years old and had never touched a real sky in his life. He did not get hurt. The Velari made sure of that. They also made sure it never happened again. The scaffolding was gone by morning. I stood there for a long time, pressing my hand into that invisible wall and letting it push me back, over and over, just to feel something real. My name is Mara Voss. I am 34 years old and I have lived on Cradle Station 7 for 9 years. Before that, I was a xenobiologist at the University of Edinburgh. I had a flat with a leaking radiator and a window that faced the wrong direction and a mug that said "World's Okayest Scientist," which my colleague Dan had given me as a joke. I loved that mug. I left it on my desk when the Velari ships came. They did not come with weapons. That is the first thing you need to understand. They came with a solution. The Galactic Council had been watching us for over a century. They watched us split atoms and map genomes and build telescopes that stared into the oldest light in the universe. They watched us argue and negotiate and fail and try again. And after 100 years of watching, the Council made a determination. Humans were a Tier 0 species, emotionally unstable, biologically fragile, incapable of handling the psychic weight of interstellar civilization without permanent psychological damage. They were not wrong about everything. We had done real damage to ourselves and to our planet. They had data. They had studies. They had 37 other species they had watched decline after contact with the wider galaxy, and they were not willing to add us to that list. So they helped us. They arrived in 17 ships over every major population center and broadcasted in every human language simultaneously. They explained what they were. They explained what we were. They offered to take us somewhere safe while Earth was stabilized, restored, and prepared for our eventual return. The word eventual was in every translation. I checked later. Most people believed them. Why wouldn't they? The ships were enormous and clean, and the Velari were graceful and calm, and they spoke our languages without an accent. They brought medicine that cured things we had been trying to cure for decades. They brought water purification systems and atmospheric scrubbers. They were, by any measure, kind. The wards, they called us. Not prisoners, not subjects. Wards, like a hospital ward, like a child in someone else's custody, like something that needed looking after until it was ready for the world. Cradle Station 7 housed about 4,000 humans. It was built to feel like a small town, which sounds pleasant until you realize every tree was synthetic, every horizon was projected, and the sky above us was not a sky at all but a curved display panel running a loop of pre-recorded sunsets. Nice sunsets, I will admit. Whoever chose them had good taste. But I had been watching the same 11 sunsets for 9 years and I could recite the order from memory. My handler was a Velari named Sarath. He was tall, as they all were, with the long pale face and the silver-threaded skin that shifted faintly with his mood, the way water moves under wind. He visited me every 12 days, which was the prescribed contact interval for humans with what the Council classified as a high-curiosity profile. I had been flagged as high curiosity early on because I asked too many questions during intake. I asked what eventual return meant on a concrete timeline. I asked who held legal authority over the station. I asked whether we could refuse the move. That last question had earned me a very long, very gentle conversation about the nature of safety and the limits of what an untreated Tier 0 species could handle. Sarath had been kind about it. He was always kind about everything. That was the problem. The data node was in Section C of the maintenance corridor, behind a panel that a Velari technician had left slightly misaligned during a routine inspection 2 months ago. I noticed it because I noticed everything. 9 years of having nothing real to do had made me very good at noticing things. I had been mapping every corridor, every relay panel, every junction on the station since year 3, not for any plan. Just because my hands needed something to do, and my mind needed somewhere to go. The node was not locked. Why would it be locked? It was a decommissioned data cache from a section of the station that had been reconfigured after the population increase in year 6. The Velari had not bothered to wipe it because it contained nothing sensitive, just operational logs and council records, the kind of administrative data that nobody would care about unless they could actually read Velari high script. I could read Velari high script. I had been teaching myself for 4 years using the fragments I found in discarded maintenance reports, technical circulars, and the one time Sareth accidentally left a personal data pad on the table during a visit, and did not notice I was reading it upside down while he refilled my water. I sat on the cold floor of the maintenance corridor with the data node in my lap, and I read for 6 hours without stopping. The records went back 80 years, 37 species, ward programs that began with the same language ours had: safety, stability, protection, eventual return. None of those species had returned. 3 of them had populations that declined so far within 2 generations that the programs were quietly reclassified as habitat preservation initiatives, which meant they were no longer people with a home to return to. They were exhibits in a nature reserve. The Council's records described this outcome as a natural conclusion to biological fragility in isolated populations. I sat with that sentence for a long time. Biological fragility in isolated populations. That was us in 20 years if nothing changed. Not because we were fragile, because isolation makes anything fragile. You take a tree out of a forest and put it in a pot and water it every day and call it cared for, and it will still die smaller than it should have lived. I put the node back exactly where I found it. I pushed the panel back into alignment. I walked back to my unit through the clean, quiet corridors of a station that had everything I needed and nothing I wanted. And I started making a list. The list started with names. People I had watched for 9 years and learned to read the way you learn to read weather. People who were still sharp under the surface, who had never fully settled into the routine, who still got angry at the projected sunsets even when they pretended they did not. Dan Cole, who had been an aerospace systems engineer before the move, and who spent his free hours in the fabrication suite building small mechanical objects for no apparent reason. Helen Bray, who had been a trauma surgeon and who now ran the station's health center with a competence that the Velari medical staff found quietly unsettling. Owen Price, who was 14 when he arrived and was now 23, and had been given a Velari Junior Science Scholarship that he accepted with a smile I did not entirely trust, which meant I trusted him completely. The list also had questions. What did Oliver reaching for the scaffold mean to me? It meant he had not been broken yet. It meant there was still something in him that understood that the sky was supposed to be reachable. It meant that if we waited long enough, the station would do what the Council's records said it always did. It would teach him that reaching was pointless, and one day he would stop. I was not going to let that happen. I went asleep that night with the data node's contents running behind my eyes. 37 species. None of them returned, and a single line buried in an administrative memo from 60 years ago, written by a council member whose name translated roughly as one who calculates long distances. The line read, Tier 0 species with high curiosity profiles should be monitored closely. Given sufficient time and motivation, they have historically proven more adaptive than initial assessments suggest. The Council had written that warning 60 years ago, and then left a misaligned panel in my maintenance corridor. I thought about that for a long time. And then I started to plan. The first thing I did was nothing. For 3 weeks, I did absolutely nothing different. I ate my meals. I attended my scheduled enrichment activities. I spoke to Sareth during his visit with my usual careful mix of curiosity and compliance. I had spent 9 years learning to perform Containment, and I was very good at it. The performance did not change. But underneath it, something had shifted permanently, the way a bone sets differently after it breaks and heals. The second thing I did was find Dan Cole. I had known Dan for 7 years. We had met in the station's community garden, which was a generous name for a room with grow lights and hydroponic trays where humans could do something with their hands. Dan was trying to grow tomatoes. He was very bad at it. He was excellent at most things and genuinely terrible at growing tomatoes, which I found humanizing. We had talked about plants and then about engineering, and then about the station's atmospheric recycling system, which Dan found structurally interesting in a way he could not fully explain even to himself. I sat down across from him in the garden room on a Tuesday afternoon, and I said, very quietly, "I need to show you something." Dan looked at me. He had been on this station for 8 years. He was 41, with the kind of stillness that comes from spending a very long time being careful. He said, "How careful do we need to be about this conversation?" I said, "Very." He nodded once. "Then not here. The recycling room in Block C, there is a 7-minute window between inspection cycles at 200. I had not told him about the inspection cycles. He had mapped them himself. I felt something settle in my chest, relief or recognition or both. We met at 200 in the recycling room in Block C, and I showed him the translated excerpts from the data node. He read slowly and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, 37 species. None returned, I said. No. He folded the printed sheet and held it in both hands. How long have you been reading their language? 4 years. And you never told anyone. I was waiting until I had something worth saying. He looked at me. Do you have something worth saying now? I have the beginning of one, I said. I need to know how many people on this station are still themselves. He understood what I meant. There were 4,000 humans on Station 7. Some of them had settled. Not broken, not deceived, just settled, the way anyone settles after enough years in a stable place. They had built lives inside the cage, and they were not wrong to do it. Survival is not a moral failure. But there were others, like Dan and like me, who had never fully stopped pressing against the walls, who kept their old skills alive for no reason they could name, who mapped inspection cycles and grew terrible tomatoes and burned through enrichment programs in 2 days because their minds refused to slow down. Those were the people I needed. Dan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is a woman in Block F named Helen Bray, trauma surgeon. She has been using her medical access to quietly study Velari biology for 6 years. She told me she does it because it helps her treat Velari staff who come to the health center. That is true. It is also not the only reason." "I know Helen," I said. "There is also a man in the fabrication suite," Dan said. "Goes by Owen Price, 23, arrived as a child. I have been watching what he builds. He is not building decorative objects." I said, "I know Owen too." Dan looked at me for a moment. "You already have a list." I wanted yours first, to see if they matched. He almost smiled. "How many names?" 11. "I want to hear yours before I add to it." He named 9 people. 8 of them were already on my list. The 9th was someone I had not considered, a woman named Claire Doyle, 56, who had been a civil engineer and who now ran the station's structural maintenance program. According to Dan, she had spent 3 years quietly reinforcing certain non-standard sections of the station frame in ways that the Velari oversight system did not flag because the changes were too small and too gradual to trigger any alert. I asked Dan why she would do that. He said he had not asked her yet because he had been waiting for a reason to. We had a reason now. The network came together over 4 months. We were careful the way only people with nothing to do and nowhere to go can be careful, which is to say, absolutely and completely. We never met in the same place twice. We never communicated through any channel that touched the station's monitoring grid. We passed notes the old-fashioned way, written in a shorthand that Helen had developed for her medical notes and that she had shared with the group piece by piece over several weeks. There were 18 of us when the network was complete. A surgeon, an aerospace engineer, a structural engineer, a linguist, which was me, a former soldier named Peter Graves who did not talk much but listened with complete attention, 2 programmers, a chemist, a teacher named Alice Ford who had been running the station's children's education program and who knew more about the layout of the station's inner systems than anyone, because the education wing shared 3 walls with the operations core, and 9 others whose skills covered gaps we had not known we had until they filled them. Dan had been building something. He told the group about it at our 4th meeting, which we held in the water reclamation substation because Claire had confirmed the sensor coverage there was minimal. He called it a communicator, short-range subspace, cobbled together from components he had borrowed, traded for, and in 2 cases quietly removed from Velari maintenance equipment that was awaiting disposal. It was small, about the size of a hardback book, and it looked like a tangle of wire and repurposed circuit boards because that was exactly what it was. But it worked. He had tested it in the maintenance corridor using a signal bounce off the station's outer hull, and it produced a clean carrier wave at the frequency the Council used for long-distance civilian communication. He said, "If I can boost the output by a factor of 6, it will reach Earth." Helen said, "Can you boost it by a factor of 6? Dan said, "I need 3 more components. I know where they are. I need about 6 weeks. Peter Graves, who had not spoken at all during the previous 3 meetings, said, "What does Earth look like right now?" Nobody knew. That was the problem and the point. The Council had told us that Earth was recovering, that the restoration was ongoing, that it would be ready for us when we were ready for it. But we had no independent source. We had only what the Council chose to tell us, filtered through handlers like Sarath, who delivered the information with the gentle certainty of someone who had already decided what was good for us. I said, "That is the first question we ask. When the communicator reaches Earth, we ask what is actually there." Alice Ford said, "And if Earth answers?" I said, "Then we stop being alone." Nobody spoke for a moment. In the quiet of the water reclamation substation, with the soft hum of recycled water moving through pipes above our heads, 18 people looked at each other and understood something that had not been spoken. We were not planning a rebellion. Not yet. We were planning a conversation. The most important conversation any of us had ever been part of. Sarath came for his scheduled visit 4 days later. He brought a new enrichment catalog. The Council had approved a new program of interactive historical simulations, which would allow humans to experience key moments from Earth's past in a safe, curated environment. He was pleased about this. He thought I would be too. I looked at the catalog. I smiled. I said the simulation sounded wonderful. He watched me with that careful affection he always had, the look of someone watching a favorite exhibit and feeling nothing but warmth, and he said, "You seem well, Mara, more settled than usual." I said, "I think I finally am." That was the first time I lied to Sarath directly. Not by omission, not by careful phrasing. A straight lie, said calmly, with my eyes meeting his silver-threaded face without a single flicker. It was easier than I expected. That frightened me a little. Not because I felt guilty, but because it meant I had been getting ready for this longer than I realized, getting ready to stop performing contentment and start using it. 6 weeks later, Dan held the completed communicator in both hands and said, "I need 30 minutes of unmonitored access to the outer relay junction." Claire Doyle said, "I can give you 32. He said, "That is enough." I said, "Then we do it Thursday." And on Thursday, with Peter Graves watching the corridor and Helen Bray running a false maintenance alert to pull the Velari monitoring staff to the north end of the station. Dan Cole climbed into the relay junction at the edge of the outer hull and pointed a homemade communicator at Earth and pressed transmit. And Earth answered. Not slowly, not cautiously. Within 47 seconds, a signal came back clean and strong and in English, from a frequency we recognized because it was the old emergency broadcast band that had been used before the move and that apparently someone on Earth had never stopped running. The voice said, "We hear you, we have been waiting. How many of you are there?" Dan looked at me. I looked at the communicator, and I thought about Sareth saying, "You seem well, Mara, more settled than usual." I pressed the transmit key and said, "Enough. I will tell you exactly what Oliver looked like when he reached for the scaffold, because I was there, and because it matters." He was standing on the lowest rung, which was about 2 meters off the ground, and he had one hand stretched as far above his head as it would go, fingers spread, eyes completely serious. He was not playing. He was not pretending. He was reaching for something specific. One of the observation windows near the top of the outer hull, where on clear display cycle nights you could see actual stars through the polymer, real light that had traveled real distances to arrive in front of his eyes. He wanted to touch that window, not the glass, the light coming through it. You could see it in his face. He understood, even at 11, that the light was real in a way the rest of the station was not. The stasis field activated when he reached the second rung. Gentle, firm, absolute. He pushed against it for a moment, confused, and then understood what it was. He climbed back down without crying, which told me more about him than anything else could have. The next morning, the scaffolding was gone. Sareth came to speak to the block supervisors about it. I was not in the meeting, but Alice Ford was, because she ran the children's program and was considered a key stakeholder in the incident review. She told me later that Sareth had spoken for 20 minutes about safety protocols and developmental risk and the Council's care for human well-being. He was not angry. He was never angry. He was concerned. He used the word protective 7 times. Alice counted. I thought about Oliver's hand pressed against invisible air. I thought about 37 species in Council records. I thought about eventual return in every translation. And 3 nights after that, Dan confirmed Earth had been in contact for 72 hours straight. Earth was not the broken planet the Council had described. It had been rebuilding, quietly, under a skeletal administration that had played exactly as cooperative as it needed to while watching and learning and waiting. They had been waiting for someone to reach out from inside the stations because they did not have the technology to reach in. We had built the bridge from this side. Earth had questions. We had answers. And Earth had something we did not have yet, a plan that was already in motion, larger and more detailed than anything 18 people in a water reclamation substation could have assembled alone. The Council detected the transmission on the 4th day. I know exactly when it happened because Sareth arrived at my unit at 3:40, which was not a scheduled visit time, and his silver-threaded skin was shifting rapidly in the pattern that I had learned, through 4 years of careful observation, meant something between alarm and confusion. In a Velari that carried itself as carefully as Sareth, that pattern was the equivalent of someone arriving at your door in the middle of the night with their shirt untucked. He said, "Mara, I need to speak with you about something serious." I said, "Of course, come in." He sat down across from me at the small table in my unit where we had had dozens of scheduled visits over the years. I put water on for tea, which was a habit I had developed because making tea gave my hands something to do while my mind worked. Sareth watched me with that careful look. He said, "There has been an unauthorized transmission from the station. The Council is concerned. We believe it may have originated somewhere in Block C." I said, "That is alarming." "It is," he said. "I want to ask you directly, Mara, because you are someone I trust, and because your profile suggests you would have noticed something unusual. Have you seen or heard anything that seemed out of place in recent weeks?" I looked at him. I thought about Oliver. I thought about 37 species. I thought about the word eventual in 17 languages. I said, "Sarath, can I ask you something first?" He nodded. "The other species in the ward programs, the 37, will they ever go home?" The shift in his skin was immediate and complex. Colors I did not have words for, yet moving through the silver thread in a sequence that was almost certainly not meant to be visible. He was startled, not by the question, but by the fact that I knew there were 37. He was quiet for several seconds. When he spoke, his voice was still careful, still kind, but something underneath it had changed. "Where did you learn about the other programs?" "From a decommissioned data node in the maintenance corridor," I said. "I have been reading your language for 4 years." He looked at me for a very long time. I looked back. "Mara," he said finally, "how much do you know?" "Enough to understand that the scaffolding was not removed for Oliver's safety," I said. "It was removed because a child reaching for the sky made someone on the council uncomfortable. I would like to know which is more important to you, keeping us comfortable or keeping us small." Sarath did not answer immediately. The colors in his skin moved slowly now, settling into a pattern I had not seen before, something quieter and more complicated than alarm. He looked at me the way you look at something when you are revising everything you thought you understood about it. He said, "A containment team has been dispatched from Council Central. They will arrive in approximately 71 hours. I said, "Then we have 71 hours. He said, "To do what?" I said, "To give you the chance to be on the right side of this." He did not answer. He stood up and walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. He did not turn around. I said, "Sarath, you wrote in my intake report that I had a high curiosity profile, and that given sufficient time and motivation I might prove more adaptive than initial assessments suggested. You wrote that 9 years ago." He was very still. I said, "You were right. I would appreciate it if you remembered that when the containment team arrives." He left without responding. I stood in the middle of my unit with the tea going cold on the table and listened to his footsteps fade down the corridor. Then I picked up the small, folded piece of paper I had prepared 3 days ago for exactly this moment, and walked to the fabrication suite to find Dan. We had 71 hours, and every single one of them was already planned. The containment team arrived in 68 hours, not 71, which meant someone had pushed for early deployment, which meant the council was more unsettled than they had shown Sarath. Dan had predicted they might move fast. Peter Graves had predicted they would move faster than that. Peter Graves was usually right about these things. There were 40 of them. Velari security personnel in the pale gray of council enforcement, carrying tools designed for crowd management and de-escalation, devices that generated calming frequencies and mild sedative mist and low-level sensory disruption. Nothing lethal. The council would never authorize lethal force against a ward species. That was one of the things we had counted on. They came through the main docking port at 6:12 station time, and spread into a standard containment pattern that any security professional would have recognized. Sweep the central hub first, establish communication blackout, locate and isolate persons of interest. What they found instead was that the central hub was empty. All 4,000 humans on Station 7 were in places they were not supposed to be, doing things that the station's monitoring system was not able to track, because Claire Doyle had spent 3 years making quiet structural modifications that created 17 dead zones in the sensor network, and Alice Ford had spent 3 months learning the operations core layout in detail. And Helen Bray had used her medical credentials to access the station's chemical supply manifest, and had quietly redirected the sedative mist canisters dispersal network, so that the calming frequency system would work against itself and cancel out. The 40 containment officers walked into a station that had been rearranged from the inside by people who had spent years learning every corner of it, and they found the doors locked, the communication systems down, and the lights set to exactly the low frequency that Velari vision found difficult. Dan was at the outer hull relay with a direct line to Earth and to 7 other stations that had received our broadcast and had their own networks and their own plans, and had been waiting for someone to go first. Peter Graves was leading a group of 9 in Block C, keeping the containment team from reaching the operations core without using anything that could be considered a threat. Just humans who knew the corridors better than their pursuers, moving in patterns that made pursuit exhausting and inefficient. Helen Bray was in the medical center with the station's entire Velari staff, not as a hostage situation. I want to be precise about this, but as a negotiation. She had gone to the Velari medical officers that morning before the containment team arrived, and she had told them exactly what was happening and why and what we wanted, and she had presented them with a complete medical analysis of Velari and human biology that she had been compiling for 6 years. It was comprehensive. It was brilliant. It was, as Helen put it to me afterward, the kind of work that gets published in the most respected journals of any civilization, and she had done it alone in a station health center in her spare time because she was a trauma surgeon and her mind did not know how to stop. The Velari medical officers had read it in 20 minutes. Then they had stayed in the medical center voluntarily. Owen Price was doing something I had not been aware of until the morning it happened, which was a failure of planning on my part that I later acknowledged directly to him. He had been given a Velari Junior Science Scholarship and had used the associated access privileges to quietly study the docked transit vessel that sat in the station's secondary port. The vessel had been left with a skeleton automation system because the Council never imagined a human would attempt to interface with Velari propulsion controls. Owen had been attempting it for 4 months. He had figured it out 3 weeks ago and said nothing until we needed it. He came to me at 5:40, an hour before the containment team arrived, and he said, "I can fly the transit vessel." I looked at him. He was 23 years old and he had lived on the station since he was 14. I said, "Are you certain?" He said, "I have run the simulation 640 times. I have not failed it in the last 200. I said, "Then be ready." The containment team spent 4 hours trying to regain control of a station that had been quietly reorganized to be incomprehensible to anyone who had not lived in it for years. They were professional and they were calm and they were not cruel. I will say that clearly, but they were completely unprepared for this. They had containment protocols for aggression, for panic, for despair. They did not have protocols for competence. They did not have protocols for a 4,000-person population that had been waiting patiently for 9 years, and had spent every one of those years getting ready for a moment exactly like this. At hour 5, the containment team leader requested a communication channel. I took the call in the operations core, which Alice Ford had helped me access through a route that bypassed the lockdown protocols. The team leader was a Velari named Velari, and his skin was doing the complex quiet pattern I had last seen on Sereth's face at 3:42 nights ago. He was not angry. He was recalibrating. He said, "I am authorized to offer a temporary suspension of containment measures in exchange for opening the docking port and restoring communication access to Council Central." I said, in Velari High Register formal speech, the dialect reserved for exchanges between equals, "I am authorized to offer a negotiated resolution in exchange for direct communication with the full Galactic Council, a temporary suspension of all ward program operations across all stations pending review, and the presence of an independent witness from any non-council species." Velari was quiet for a moment that was long even by Velari standards. Then he said, in the same formal register I had used, which meant he had recognized and accepted the implied status claim, "I will relay your terms." I said, "Please also relay this. We have documentation of all 37 prior ward programs and their outcomes. We have independent communication with Earth and with 6 other stations. And we have a transit vessel that can reach neutral space in 4 hours if this conversation goes poorly." Another silence. "I will relay everything," he said. I closed the channel and turned around. Dan was behind me with the communicator in his hands and his eyebrows raised. I said, "How are the other stations?" He said, "Station 3 went dark for 40 minutes, but they are back. Station 9 is fully active. Station 12 has not responded since 800, but Earth says they have visual confirmation of activity from the hull." I said, "Tell Earth we are in negotiation. Tell them to hold." Dan nodded. Then he said, "Mara, Sareth is outside the operations core door. He has been there for 2 hours." I had not known that. I walked to the door and opened it. Sareth was standing in the corridor with his hands at his sides, and his skin was still doing the quiet, complex pattern, and he looked at me for a moment before speaking. He said, "I did not tell the containment team about the dead zones in the sensor network." I looked at him. He said, "I knew about them. Claire Doyle's modifications. I reviewed the maintenance reports 14 months ago and I understood what they were. I filed them as routine structural work." "Why?" I said. He was quiet for a long time. The silver in his skin moved slowly. "Because the warning in our internal records is 60 years old," he said. "And in 60 years nobody acted on it. And I thought, if I were in a cage, even a very comfortable one, and someone warned that I might eventually find a way out, I would hope that someone would at least leave the door slightly unlocked." I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Come inside. I think you should be in the room when the council calls back." He came inside. The council called back 6 hours later. Not a relay message. A direct communication from Council Central, which meant they had convened in session, which meant our terms had reached the full body. The communication carried the formal seal of the Galactic Council, which in Velari protocol signified that what followed was on the record and binding. The voice that came through was not a security officer. It was a council senior adjudicator named Threshavelan, and when I responded in high-register formal speech, he was silent for almost 10 seconds. Then he said, "The council is prepared to open preliminary discussions." I said, "The council can do better than preliminary." He said, "These matters require." I said, 37 species and none of them returned. We would prefer not to become the 38th. I believe the council has the data to understand our position." A longer silence. Then Threshavelan said, "What are your terms?" I looked around the operations core. Dan at the communicator, Alice at the system panel, Peter Graves standing near the door, still and quiet, Helen on the secondary channel from the medical center, Sareth beside me with his silver-threaded skin doing something I had never seen before, something that looked in the uncertain lighting almost like hope. I said, "Our terms are 3. First, restoration of Earth's sovereignty, full and unconditional within 1 standard galactic year. Second, dissolution of the ward program for all species currently enrolled with independent resettlement support. Third, full membership for Earth in the Galactic Council, not as an observer, not as an associate, but as a voting member." I said, "We are prepared to negotiate the timeline. We are not prepared to negotiate the outcome." Threshavelan said, "You understand that the 3rd term is unprecedented." I said, "I understand that. I also understand that the first 2 terms were unprecedented 30 minutes ago, and here we are." Another silence. "We will require time," he said. I said, "Take what you need. We are not going anywhere." Dan almost laughed. I could see him suppress it from across the room. Threshavelan said, "We will respond within 6 hours with a formal session proposal." I said, "We will be here." The channel closed. The operations core was quiet for a moment. Then Alice Ford put her face in her hands and made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughing, but something that had no better name. Dan said, 6 hours. I said, 6 hours. Peter Graves said, for only the second time in the entire operation, "I would like some tea." I looked at him. I thought about Oliver on the scaffold. I thought about the stasis field pushing my hand back. I thought about that mug that said, "World's okayest scientist," sitting on a desk in Edinburgh 9 years ago. I said, "Yes, I think we all would." The formal session came in 4 hours, not 6, which was the first indication that the council was operating with something other than its usual careful composure. I took the call at the main communication station in the operations core, with Dan monitoring the signal and Sarath standing off to my right in a position that was neither staff nor prisoner, just present, which was appropriate given that I was not entirely sure how to classify him either. The session opened with the standard Galactic Council preamble, which ran to about 3 minutes of formal language establishing jurisdiction and record. I waded through all of it without interrupting, which I could see surprised the adjudicators. They had been expecting impatience. I had learned patience the way you learn anything in a cage with good lighting and nothing real to do completely, and with nowhere else to put it. Threshavelan led the session. There were 7 adjudicators visible in the transmission, and beyond them the broader chamber, which the feed angle showed only partially but which was clearly full. I had studied council session protocol carefully enough to know that a full chamber meant the session had been classified as first-tier significance. The last first-tier session on record in the data I had recovered was 90 years ago, when 2 galactic-scale species had disputed a transit corridor. We were in that category now. 4,000 humans on one station, with 18 people in an operations core and a homemade communicator, had become a first-tier significance event. I found this both humbling and deeply satisfying. Threshavelan said, "The Council has reviewed your stated terms and is prepared to discuss all 3. However, the Council wishes to understand one thing before we proceed." I said, "Ask." "You had the capacity to leave the station," he said. "The transit vessel. You could have gone to neutral space, and this would have become an interstellar incident of a very different kind. Why did you not?" I said, "Because we did not want to leave. We wanted to come back. There is a difference between escaping and being free, and we have always known which one we were after." Threshavelan looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "That is a very precise distinction." I said, "We are a very precise species when we have time to think." The negotiations ran for 11 hours. I will not walk through every exchange because that could fill a longer document than this one, and some of it was technical and procedural rather than significant. But the shape of it was this. The Council came in expecting to offer symbolic concessions and timeline extensions and commitments to review. I came in with documented outcomes from 37 prior programs, independent legal analysis that Helen and our 2 programmers had built from Council records over the previous 18 months, and a clear, specific, non-negotiable list of 3 things. We did not get all 3 on the first day. We got 2. Term 1, the restoration of Earth's sovereignty, was agreed in full by the end of the 3rd session hour. The Council had been expecting to fight on this one. They were surprised by how quickly I accepted their proposed timeline, which was longer than I wanted, and then surprised again when I produced a counter-proposal with specific benchmarks and independent verification mechanisms that made their timeline workable. They had expected demands or anger. I gave them engineering. Term 2, dissolution of the Ward program for all species, took longer. There were council members who genuinely believed the programs were beneficial and who were not acting from contempt but from a misguided certainty that they knew best. I understood this feeling. I had watched Sarath operate from it for 9 years, and I could not fully hate it even when I fought it. I said to the chamber during the 4th hour, "The measure of whether care is genuine is not what the caregiver intends. It is what the person being cared for is able to become. Judge the programs by their outcomes. We have all the documentation." That argument carried more than I expected. 3 council members who had been quiet throughout the session spoke in support. One of them, a species I had not encountered in the data before, said formally, "We have argued for this reform for 40 years and been outvoted. We are glad the argument is being made from a different position today." I said, "You could have reached out to us." The council member said, "We were not certain you were ready." I said, "With respect, you could have asked." That moment went into the record. I know because Threshavelan flagged it specifically, which in council protocol meant it would be cited in future proceedings. A first-tier session record is referenced for generations. I was glad to have something worth citing in it. Term 3, council membership, took 2 more full sessions spread over the following 3 days. It was the hardest negotiation and the most important one. The objections were not all cynical. Some council members argued genuinely that Earth had not demonstrated sufficient stability for full membership, and while I rejected the framing, I did not dismiss the concern entirely. What I said was, every member of this council was, at some point, new to the experience of galactic-scale decision-making. You learned. We will learn. The difference is that we are asking to learn with you rather than to be managed by you, and I believe that distinction will produce better outcomes for everyone in this chamber. The vote on Term 3 carried on the 14th of the following month, in a session that Threshavelan closed by nodding for the record that the proceedings had been conducted with a degree of precision and composure that the council found instructive. I accepted that, in the spirit it was offered. There were things that happened in the weeks after the vote that I will describe quickly, because they matter even if they do not fit neatly into the shape of the story. Dan Cole went back to Earth on the first authorized human transport in 11 years, and spent 3 days standing in an empty field in the part of the country where he had grown up, not doing anything, just standing. He told me later that he had been testing whether it felt real. It did. Helen Bray was asked to submit her Velari biological research to the Joint Medical Council, and it was accepted and published and drew more attention than she had expected, which embarrassed her and pleased her in equal measure. Owen Price enrolled in a joint human Velari astrophysics program that had been established as part of the settlement terms. He was the first human in it. He was also the youngest. Oliver, the boy from the scaffold, now 13, enrolled 8 months after Owen. When I heard that, I sat very still for a moment and felt something that did not have a precise name. Sarath asked to meet me privately 2 weeks after the final vote. We sat at the same small table where we had sat for 9 years of scheduled visits, and the tea was on again, and the station outside the window was still the same station with the same projected sunsets, but something about the air was different in a way that neither of us commented on. He said, "I voted for the cognitive adjustment measure, the procedure that was proposed before you found the data node. I want you to know that." I had not known. I looked at him. He said, "I believed it was the safest option. I was afraid of what your species would do if full capacity was not managed. I have thought about that vote many times in the past weeks." I said, "Are you telling me because you want forgiveness?" He said, "I am telling you because I think you deserve to know the complete picture of who I was in this process. I was kind to you. I was also afraid of you. Both things were real." I said, "I know." He said, "I voted against the measure in the end. I know that does not undo the first vote." I said, "No, but it is the vote that is in the record." He nodded. I said, "Sarath, You left a misaligned panel in a maintenance corridor." He looked at me. I said, "I have wondered for a long time whether it was an accident." The silver in his skin moved in the quiet, complex pattern that I still did not have a full translation for. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I reviewed the maintenance corridor after the inspection. I noticed the panel. I filed the report without flagging it." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because you had been on this station for 7 years and your curiosity profile was still high, and you had learned the enrichment programs so fast that we kept having to replace them, and I thought, if I were in a cage and someone came close to where the key was, I would hope that the guard looked away." I said very quietly, "You used those exact words." He said, "I know." We sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "The child who reached for the scaffold, Oliver, he is 13 now. He is going to study real stars." Sarah said, "I heard." I said, "That is what this was for. Not the council seat, not the documentation, not the formal record. That is what this was for. A 13-year-old boy who can reach for something and not be pushed back." Sarah said, "I understand that now." I said, "I hope the council does too." He said, "I think some of them are beginning to." 2 months after the settlement, I stood before the full Galactic Council as Earth's first appointed ambassador. I had prepared remarks. I had worked on them for 3 weeks. Dan had read them and said they were good. Helen had read them and made 4 corrections, all of them right. Peter Graves had read them and said nothing, which from Peter meant they were exactly what they needed to be. I stood at the speaker's position in the council chamber, which was much larger in person than it appeared on the transmission, with 300 council representatives from dozens of species arranged in curved tiers above me, and I looked out at all of them and I said, "I am not here to describe what was done to my species. The record speaks for itself, and the council has read it. I am here to describe what we would like to build instead." I spoke for 40 minutes. I spoke about what cooperation between genuine equals could look like. I spoke about the 37 species and the knowledge that had been lost because it was never trusted. I spoke about Oliver without using his name, a child who reached for a real sky and was pushed back by something designed to protect him, and how the most expensive thing you can take from any living being is not safety but possibility. I said, "You were afraid of what we would become if you let us grow. I understand that. Fear of the unknown is not unique to any species, but you chose to manage the unknown rather than learn it, and the cost of that choice was borne entirely by the species you were afraid of, which is not how fear is supposed to work between people who mean each other well." I said, "We are here now. We are at this table, and we would like, with your genuine partnership and not your management, to be part of whatever this council does next." The chamber was quiet when I finished. Then Threshavelan, who was serving as session chair, said formally, "The chair recognizes Ambassador Voss's address and enters it into the permanent record." One of the council members who had supported our terms throughout the process, the one who had said they had argued for 40 years and been outvoted, spoke next. They said, "On behalf of my species and 3 others who have asked me to convey this, we welcome Earth's membership. We are glad you are here. We are also glad you are still yourselves." I said, "So are we." Afterward, in the reception corridor, a junior council aide, a young Velari with quick movements and a high-curiosity skin pattern that I recognized immediately, came up to me and asked, in careful formal English that they had clearly been practicing, "Ambassador, how long did it take you?" I said, "How long did it take me?" They said, "To learn our language, so precisely." I said, 4 years, and a lot of patience." They said, "I am studying English. I have been for 2 years." I looked at this young Velari, standing in the corridor of a council chamber where humans had never stood before, learning a language just in case they would one day need it to talk to us on equal terms, and I felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite joy, but lived somewhere between them. I said, "Then you are already halfway there." They smiled, which was not a Velari expression, but they had learned it somewhere, and they walked away, and I stood in the corridor and thought about Dan growing terrible tomatoes. I thought about Peter Graves asking for tea. I thought about Helen's medical research and Claire's quiet structural reinforcements and Alice mapping the operations core through 3 walls of the education wing, and Owen flying a ship he had never sat in through 200 simulations until he could not fail it. I thought about Sareth walking away from my door in the middle of the night and not telling anyone about the dead zones. I thought about a boy named Oliver pressing his hand against the invisible air where the sky should have been. They had watched us for 100 years and decided we were not ready. They watched us in our cages and called us fragile. They gave us everything we needed and none of what we wanted and called it care. What they missed, what I hope they are only beginning to understand, is that we had been building the key for years. Every mapped corridor and learned language and reverse-engineered schematic and quiet structural modification was a tooth on that key. We had been cutting it in secret with borrowed tools and the slow, patient work of people who refused to forget what they were capable of. We just needed them to look away long enough for us to use it. And now we were at the table, not because we had overpowered anyone, not because we had made threats or demanded sympathy, but because we had shown up, prepared, precise, and unbroken, and we had said, "We are here, and we are staying, and we have work to do." I walked out of the Galactic Council chamber into a corridor that was the same temperature and pressure and artificial light as any other corridor in any other station I had ever known, and for a moment it felt the same as all of them. Then I looked up and saw, through a window at the end of the hall, actual stars. Not a projection. Not a display cycle. Real light from real distances arriving in real time, and nobody between me and it. I reached up and pressed my hand against the glass. Nothing pushed back.